My name is Emily, and I am 31 years old. The smell of expensive pine still makes my jaw tighten because that was the night my brother stood up and announced our parents had signed a succession agreement they believed, stripped me of my CEO title, attempting to gift him the company I built while claiming I was getting nothing. We were seated around my parents' long oak table, the same one where I'd once balanced invoices and laptops, while everyone else watched football, and the candles flickered like they knew something awful was coming. My brother cleared his throat with that practiced, tailored confidence he always wore like a suit, lifted his glass, and said it loudly enough to pin every conversation to the wall. Welcome to Sibling Scars and Revenge. Have you ever felt like you're invisible in your own family? Please, share your story in the comments below. Just like right now, I'm out for a drive to find some peace of mind. What about you? Where are you watching from? And what time is it there? I'd love to connect with you. Jacob's words didn't just hang in the air, they acted like a physical weight, pressing the oxygen out of the room. He looked around the table, his eyes bright with a predatory kind of triumph, waiting for me to shatter. He expected tears. He expected a high-pitched defense of the 7 years I had spent working 16-hour days, to pull that firm from a drafty studio into a $12 million powerhouse. My mother, Sarah, wouldn't meet my gaze, suddenly fascinated by the stem of her wine glass, while my father, Michael, studied the grain of the oak table as if searching for a legal loophole in the wood itself. I didn't cry, I didn't even flinch, because I felt a strange, icy clarity settle over me. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, funding their lifestyle and Jacob's failed dreams. While I survived on caffeine and stubbornness, my compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, but tonight, the account was closed. I reached for my wine glass, feeling the condensation cool against my skin, and I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for them. This silence wasn't a sign of defeat. In my head, I realized that for over a decade, I had been living in an invisible prison. It is a psychological phenomenon called learned helplessness, the invisible chains of the survivor. When you are raised in a house where your competence is a threat and your brother's mediocrity is a treasure, you learn to stay quiet just to survive. You think if you just work harder, if you just provide more, they will finally see you. You become a prisoner in a house without bars, believing that your silence is the price of peace. But tonight, those chains didn't feel heavy anymore. They felt like a fuse I was ready to light. I set the glass down with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I looked directly at my father, watching the exact moment the smugness on Jacob's face began to flicker. "Should I tell them now, Dad?" I asked, my voice as clinical as a balance sheet. "Or do you want to?" The question landed like a heavy stone in a still pond. My father's eyes widened, holding the sudden panic of a man who realized a locked drawer had just been rattled. He started to stammer about family unity and the holiday spirit, but I was already under the table, my thumb tapping a final command on my phone to revoke Jacob's administrative access to the firm's secure servers. This wasn't a breakdown, it was accounting. I looked around the room, realizing that my parents weren't just shocked by what I'd said, they were shocked that I had stopped playing along. For 22 years, I had been the silent architect of their comfort. I started this firm when I was 23 with a $150,000 loan, a debt I took on because my parents refused to spare a dime of their lodge's equity to help me, which I personally repaid with interest, while working from a studio so drafty I had to wear gloves just to type. My brother Jacob, meanwhile, was busy finding himself on my dime, embarking on a series of failed real estate developments that I ended up quietly funding just to keep the family name out of the red. Every milestone I reached was treated like a footnote in the epic of Jacob's potential. When I landed my first seven-figure contract, my mother gave me a tight smile and then spent 40 minutes discussing Jacob's new golf club membership. I had spent years being the reliable one, the one who didn't need attention because I could handle things myself. But what I was actually witnessing was a psychological phenomenon known as the trap of normalizing cruelty. In many toxic families, parents reach a point where they feel comfortable sacrificing the competent child to protect the ego of the golden child. They see your strength not as a quality to be celebrated, but as a resource to be harvested. Because I was capable, they felt I didn't need the loyalty or the equity I had earned. They normalized the idea that my labor belonged to Jacob because he was too weak to build his own. It was a business transaction where they had been overdrawing on my compassion for a decade, assuming I would never check the balance. But the valuation of my sweat isn't zero. Those nights powered by cheap coffee and stubborn hope built a firm worth $12 million. I thought of the specific contracts I negotiated with, hands shaking under the table, the payroll weeks when I paid my team before myself, and the absolute precision required to build this legacy. My father sat there, still clutching the illusion that he could sign away my life's work like a piece of unwanted furniture. He looked at me, his face, a mask of aging authority, and said, "Emily, we did this for the stability of the family. Jacob is a leader who had never written a single line of a business plan, a leader who viewed my firm as a lifestyle subsidy rather than a professional responsibility." I realized then that their version of togetherness was just a prettier word for control. They hadn't invited me to a dinner, they'd invited me to my own professional funeral. But as I sat there, the heat behind my eyes cooled into a sharp, lethal precision. I wasn't just a licensed architect of buildings anymore, I was the architect of their reckoning. My mother finally found her voice, but it wasn't to offer an apology or bridge back to sanity. Instead, she reached for a weaponized version of maternal concern. "Emily, honey, you're being dramatic," she said, her voice trembling with a rehearsed fragility as she dabbed her eyes with a silk napkin. "The long hours at the firm have clearly taken a toll on your mental state. You're becoming unstable." It was the classic opening move of the gaslighter label, the victim's reaction as the problem, to avoid looking at the actual crime. My father, Michael, shifted in his seat, his expression hardening from panic into a rigid, righteous anger. "We're trying to protect the family legacy, Emily," he added, his voice booming as if volume could replace validity. "Jacob provides the leadership and stability this family needs. You're making a scene and ruining the spirit of togetherness over a few percentages." They were using togetherness as a shield, hoping the weight of the holiday and the presence of our relatives would force me to shrink back into the compliant, quiet daughter they had harvested for years. But I had already realized that a togetherness built on lies is just a prettier word for control. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to defend my sanity or beg them to see the 7 years of work I had poured into that $12 million firm. I simply took another slow sip of my wine, tasting the cold clarity of a plan that was already in motion. I had spent a decade being the reliable one, but tonight, I was the one who was taking control. "Stability is an interesting choice of words. Dad," I said, my voice as clinical as a forensic report. I didn't wait for a response. I reached into my bag and pulled out a high-tech tablet, sliding it to the center of the table, next to the centerpiece of pine and candles. I tapped the screen, and a calm, professional voice filled the room. "I'm here, Emily. The digital audit of the firm's holding accounts is complete," Walter said. I officially introduced Walter to the table as my forensic accountant, a man I had paid a staggering holiday premium to ensure he was on standby for this exact moment. The room went from the artificial warmth of a Christmas dinner to the clinical chill of a boardroom in a heartbeat. I told my parents that truth, once invited, doesn't ask for permission. I had shifted the fight from their oak dinner table to a professional legal arena where their gaslighting held no currency. While they had spent months secretly planning to hand my life's work to my brother, I had spent months hoarding the only thing I trusted, a paper trail. I had the original incorporation papers listing me as the 100% owner. I had every email chain where they had pushed me to keep our agreements informal while I insisted on legal signatures. I watched the relatives lean forward, their forks hovering as the performance of peace began to crack. My mother's hand froze midair, and my father's face turned the color of cold ash. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a systematic exposure of a betrayal that had been years in the making. The silence that followed was no longer the heavy, suffocating kind my family used to control me. It was the sharp, clinical silence of a courtroom. Jacob's face was a map of deteriorating confidence, his eyes darting toward my parents, looking for a rescue that wasn't coming. I tapped the tablet again, and a series of bank statements and loan agreements flooded the screen, projected for everyone to see. This was the lethal discovery, the kill shot that would remove any remaining path to redemption for the people across from me. Jacob didn't just want my company because he felt entitled to it, I said, my voice cutting through the festive room like a cold wind. He needed it because he's been running a criminal fraud right under your noses. I looked at my parents, seeing the sheer, unadulterated shame in their eyes. For months, Jacob had been taking out massive predatory loans totaling $3,400,000 using my parents' identities and their luxury lodge as collateral. He had gambled their retirement on his failed developments, and when the bills came due, he went to them with a deal. The firm I built, the one valued at $12 million, wasn't being gifted to Jacob because he was a leader. It was being handed over as a desperate payment. My parents were willing to sacrifice my entire life's work, my legacy, and my future, just to hide their own financial ruin from the rest of the family. They weren't protecting the family legacy, they were protecting their own egos. They traded my sweat and blood to buy Jacob's silence and cover their own narcissistic injury. I watched as the relatives around the table began to murmur, the word forgery rippling through the air like a contagion. One of my aunts gasped, her hand over her mouth, as she realized the golden child was actually a felon in a tailored suit. My father tried to look away, but the evidence was glowing on the table, an undeniable record of their betrayal. This wasn't a family dynamic anymore, it was a criminal enterprise built on a rotten foundation, and I was the one who was finally pulling the rug out from under them. I didn't feel the need to shout, the numbers on the screen were doing all the screaming for me. I looked at Jacob, whose rage was now raw and naked, his illusion of inheritance stripped away in front of everyone who mattered to him. He was no longer the hero of a story he never wrote, he was a liability that had just been liquidated. Truth is an absolute defense, and tonight, it was my greatest asset. The tailored suit that Jacob always wore like armor suddenly looked like it was 3 sizes too big for him. His confidence didn't just break, it evaporated, replaced by a desperate, frantic kind of rage that made him lunge across the table toward the tablet, as if he could physically grab the truth and pull it back. I didn't move an inch. I watched him with the clinical detachment of an architect observing a condemned building finally collapse under its own weight. This was the psychological breakdown I had anticipated. It is a moment that reveals the illusion of power in an empty wallet. For years, Jacob's authority wasn't built on his own competence or character. It was a rented mask, paid for by my parents' favoritism and my tireless labor. When you strip away the material, leverage the titles he didn't earn, the firm he didn't build, and the bank accounts he drained, a person like Jacob has no internal foundation to stand on. He wasn't losing a company, he was losing the only thing that made him feel superior, and without that hollow status, he was nothing but a frightened child in an expensive suit. My father, Michael, was the next to crack. The weight of proof, $150,000 in a loan. I had personally repaid $12 million in firm valuation and $3,400,000 in fraudulent debt. Jacob had bent his shoulders forward until he looked 20 years older than when he sat down. His eyes were red with the naked panic of a man who realized his social standing was a pile of ash. "Emily, please," he whispered, his voice cracking on my name in a way it never had before. "We are your parents. We cannot lose the lodge. We cannot have this go to the authorities. Think about the family name. Think about your brother." I didn't feel the warmth of pity or the heat of anger. I felt like an accountant closing a ledger on a long, overdrawn account. "I already did think about my family, Dad," I said, my voice flat, cold, and final. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the oak table where the Christmas dinner sat, cold and untouched. I had given my father and Jacob those honorary board seats years ago, a hollow gift to soothe their egos while I did the actual work. But as the sole shareholder, those seats were always a courtesy. And today, that courtesy has expired. It was a shareholder action by written consent, a legal document I had already filed with the state this morning as the 100% owner, officially dissolving the board and terminating Jacob's access to any corporate assets. The rest will be handled by Walter and my legal team. I am choosing competence over blood from here on out. I stood up, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that signaled the end of our version of togetherness. I didn't wait for the apologies that were only being offered because they were out of cards to play. I thanked the rest of the relatives for their time and walked out into the crisp, biting mountain air. My heart was racing, but my spine was straight. For the first time in 31 years, I wasn't carrying the crushing weight of their expectations. I was finally light. A few months after that night at the lodge, I stood on the floor-to-ceiling balcony of my new office suite, 40 floors above the city. The skyline below is a tapestry of steel and glass, a shimmering grid of light that stretched toward the horizon. I could look out and point to 3 different high-rises that I had personally designed, tangible, soaring proof of 7 years of my blood, sweat, and absolute precision. The crisp mountain air of that Christmas Eve retreat felt like a lifetime ago, a distant nightmare that had finally been scrubbed from the ledgers of my life. The legal fallout was as clinical as I had intended it to be. Jacob is currently facing a litany of charges for felony fraud and identity theft, related to those $3,400,000 loans he took out in our parents' names. Without my firm to use as a shield, his entire house of cards collapsed in weeks. My parents, Michael and Sarah, are living in a much smaller, quieter reality now. They were forced to liquidate the luxury lodge and most of their assets to cover the predatory debts their golden child left behind. They reached out to me once, a desperate email filled with the same old hollow words about family loyalty and the sanctity of blood, but I didn't even open it. I simply hit delete and went back to my blueprints. My compassion was a luxury they could no longer afford. Severing those toxic ties wasn't a tragedy. It was a final necessary liquidation of a bad asset that had been draining my emotional reserves for decades. I have come to realize that peace without fairness is just forced silence, and I am no longer willing to pay the premium for a version of family that requires my erasure. I've spent a lot of time recently thinking about the path that brought me here, and if you find yourself in a similar situation, I want to share the lessons I've earned. This is for the worker bees, the ones who have spent years being the silent investors in someone else's ego. For the longest time, I believed that if I just worked harder, built a firm worth $12 million, or stayed quiet through one more insulting dinner, they would finally see me. But you cannot negotiate with people who only see you as a resource to be harvested. You are not difficult for setting boundaries, and you are not selfish for protecting the legacy you built with your own 2 hands. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't staying to fix a broken house, it's having the courage to walk away and build a new one on a foundation of truth. Forgiveness isn't always about reconciling with the people who betrayed you sometimes. It is the quiet, private act of setting yourself free from the prison of their approval. I am Emily, the lead architect of my own destiny, and for the first time in my life, my foundation is solid. The truth finally took its rightful seat at my table, and it brought a peace that no amount of money could ever buy. I am no longer performing for an audience that refused to see me. I am finally free. If you're ready to stop being the family doormat and start being the architect of your own life, hit that subscribe button and share this story